Good morning and welcome to Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion. My name is Isa Buencamino.
And I'm Hannah Wilson.
And today we'll be hosting the webcast, our third of a series of 12 conversations. So Fast Forward Diversity and Inclusion. It's a series of conversations where we aim to build from people who have been doing this agenda for a long time. And so for advocates or people who are new to the agenda, I'm hoping that you can stand on the shoulders of these giants and take the agenda forward. So our guest today is one of 12 we've invited. And Hannah, would you like to introduce our guest today?
We are delighted this morning to be joined by Professor Paul Miller. Paul is a Professor of Educational Leadership and Social Justice. He is the President of the Commonwealth Council for Educational Administration and Management. Paul was the first Black Professor of Educational Leadership in the UK. I'm going to let that one to settle and sink in. The first Black Professor of Educational Leadership in the UK. He has a significant body of research, so many publications that we've lost track, with a particular focus on the career progression of teachers and academics of BAME heritage in England. And I have to say, Paul, you're one of my professional crushes. I've got so much respect for you and the work you do. So we're absolutely delighted that you are here today. So first question from me. As a BAME activist and campaigner, how did you start your advocacy work, and what's your motivation? Why do you do it, Paul?
Well, thank you, Hannah and Isa, for inviting me to this important conversation. I have started this work a long time ago because I feel it's really important that this work continues. You see, you mentioned earlier in your introduction that we're standing on the shoulders of giants, and that is exactly how I feel. I feel like so many persons have walked this road before. So many persons have toiled in the trenches, and we are not there yet. And therefore, our journey is long, and it's a continuing struggle. And the struggle needs me, the struggle needs you, the struggle needs all of us. And so for me, it was not an option per se, but it was an important necessity and something that I simply had to do, because it was felt like, well, I'm lucky to have the platform that I have through my work and through my research in the university, and to be able to take the agenda forward, to give voice to some of the issues, to help people make sense and make meaning of some of the problems. But for me, it wasn't a choice. It was destiny in a sense, because this is too important not to get involved.
Yeah, no, I feel the same way. I mean, as an Asian woman, I recognize that, the agenda has been here a long time. And despite the fact, we still have very poor representation of, BAME in leadership roles, whether it's in education, where you're from, Paul, or from corporate, where I'm from. And it's still not fixed. Why do you think that is?
I think it comes down, in my view, to society. And don't forget that we are all part of society. It comes down to individuals who, when we think about racism, for example, there is personal racism, those private and personal beliefs that are held by individuals. And until individuals get rid of those beliefs, in the song of the legendary Bob Marley, until the philosophy that holds one race superior and another one inferior. And that's the crux of personal racism. Until people get rid of those beliefs that I am better, or you're worth less because of race or because of the color of your skin, then we will still be having this conversation 20 years, 50 years, 500 years from now. So that's the first part of it. And the second part of it is that Our institutions are microcosms of society. Our schools, our churches, our banks, the insurance companies, corporate, you know, world, those are microcosm of society. And the people, me and you and others like us, we take our personal and private beliefs of racism and we bring them into the organization. And then the organization becomes a social milieu of racism, transmitting the values that we have, replicating them, sedimenting them. And then that becomes part of the problem, because the problem then is not only at a personal or interpersonal level, but it's at an institutional level. And then if all the institutions are doing it, then we have the multiplier effect, becomes the systemic racism. So we see just in this case, we have these 4 levels of racism going wild and wide very quickly, because it is starting with us as individuals. Then we share these views with our friends and families and so on, interpersonal racism. Then we go into our organizations and we do the same things, and we form cliques and groups, and we don't call out stuff. And we don't challenge stuff, and we write policies and we make them advantage or disadvantage. And then if every organization or every institution is doing the same thing, then this is what we find: the problem becomes sedimented in society. So I think the answer to that question is because of society. We are society. We set the boundaries of what we want to accept and what we don't want to accept, and we hold ourselves accountable. And so I am very pleased that we are having these conversations, because people are saying, actually, this has gone on for too long, and we are intolerant of this madness. We are intolerant of this inequity, and we have to do something about it, because this is not the society that I want to be part of. This is not the society that I want my children to grow up in. This is not the society that I want to be remembered for being a part of, but I want to challenge these things. And I think so it's really incredibly important that we look and put ourselves up against the mirror of society, because believe it or not, we are part of that society.
Absolutely, Paul. And talking about microcosms and talking about institutions, obviously the education system is a microcosm of society. And if we can't get it right in education, then we're not going to break the cycle. So if we're thinking specifically about educational and systemic racism within the education sector particularly, I know we've got more of a focus on it now, but we need to get the pace, we need to get the strategy, we need to get the intentional action. What are your hopes? What's your vision for what the education system could and should do to challenge the institutional racism that we know exists?
Well, as you know, I've got this body of work, and I talk about the different types of leaders in one of my typology, the typology of leaders. And I think our part of the solution is about leadership. Now, leadership is not going to solve everything, but leadership is the most significant ingredient in tackling racism and malpractice in educational institutions. As you have seen from my work, I argue that there are 3 types of educational leaders, or 3 types of leaders more broadly. You have the indifferent leader who argues that, well, actually, race isn't a problem here. It's not a problem for our organization. I've not had a complaint. Nobody has said anything. So let's just move on, because it's not a problem here. And then you have the sympathizers. And within the sympathizers, there are two types. You have the passive sympathizers who says, well, there is a problem, but I don't know what to do. And more worryingly, they do not seek any help to tackle these problems. So they acknowledge that there's a problem, but sit on their hands in trying to tackle this problem. And then you have the performative sympathizers who actually says there is a problem, but they invest only minimally in trying to solve this problem. So they will do only the least possible thing, or their intervention is usually around some self-interest or some interest convergence. So if I'm going to be tackling the issue of race, then we tag that on to tackling the issue of gender, or we tag that on to tackling something else. And that is not to say that there's a hierarchy of equality. That is not what I'm saying at all. But sometimes the issues need to be unpicked and need to be looked at on their own and very carefully and very, very deeply. And I think that the performative sympathizers are the most dangerous form of leaders. And sadly, I think that those are the ones who are the most that we have around town. And then you have the accidental activists who are saying, well, actually, there is a problem. I am not sure what my input is going to achieve. But one thing I'm sure of is that not doing anything is not an option. I am going to do something. And then we have the deliberate activists who are saying, listen, this problem is too big, it's too huge, that we should sit on our hands. So the work that you and I and Isa are doing this morning, Hannah, this is around deliberate activism. This is saying this problem has gone on for too long. This is saying, listen, we cannot sit on our hands anymore. We cannot sit on our hands any longer. So we need leadership of organizations or leadership of education institutions that put money, that put time, that put the resources, that put the right people, not tokenism. So you're not going to simply put a Black person in charge because the Black person is screaming the most about the problem of racism and discrimination. You're not going to just put somebody in charge because you want to pacify them and you give them no autonomy and no money and no room. But you are going to do this because it is the right thing to do. And justice and fairness are simply the right thing to do as a leader.
Fantastic. I want to ask you about how to be a deliberate activist. I mean, if you were to advise, if I was head of a corporation, I mean, I want to do the right thing. What do I need to do? What are the 3 things you would suggest somebody like that should start doing now?
Thank you for that, Isa. I think being a deliberate activist is certainly the ideal, and I challenge every single educational leader and every leader in every organization, in education, outside of education, in corporate, to become that. And I think the first thing I would suggest is to develop the language of race. There is a lot of debate and inconsistency around when we talk about race and we talk about racism. And I think it's really, really incredibly important that that person develops a personal understanding of racism and its effects. The second thing I think that person needs to do is to do case study research of their institution. You need to unearth the experiences of the minoritized group of people in your organization. You cannot try to fix a problem without first understanding the depth and the significance and the magnanimity of the problem, right? You need to do case study research of your institution. And the third thing I think you need to do as a leader is to commit personally to walking this problem through. That is not to say you are the one who's going to solve it. But what it's saying is you are going to create the culture in the organization that nobody can opt out. We are going to tackle racism. And if you're going to work here, then you are going to be part of that solution. But you're not going to bring in your private beliefs of racism and think that they will flourish here. But we are going to stamp it out. So there's a personal commitment. There are resources, people with the expertise to support, to challenge, to scaffold, and all of that kind of thing. And I think that is where the leadership needs to really take center stage. And those would be the 3 things I would say.
Thank you, Paul. And ultimately, we're talking about allyship here, aren't we? That we're talking about everybody seeing it as their responsibility, a collective responsibility, a shared vision, that we really need white, straight, educators to step up and lean in and speak out and commit to this. And I'm hearing so many stories about schools and Mats asking the person of colour to do this work themselves. So how can we make sure that we have a top-down approach and we have the governors and the senior leadership teams that quite often aren't representative leading this activity, and it doesn't become another burden for the people of colour to actually shoulder?
I think you're right. In some of my writing, I talk about this synergistic approach. And the synergistic approach is one that is neither top-down nor bottom-up, but is one that is inclusive and embracing. And I think this is the place that we are now in our history, that we are seeing so many people who wouldn't necessarily put themselves out normally, or who wouldn't necessarily call themselves a leader within the organization, getting involved, lobbying for change, calling for change. And I absolutely think that that is the right way we need to go. But what leaders can do, Hannah, is make a bigger table. Invite those voices around the table and say, come, governors, school leaders, BME colleagues, white colleagues, students, parents, let's have a serious conversation about race in our schools. And let's not be ashamed about it. We've got a problem, and let's see how we can tackle it. But that's where the leadership comes in. The leadership is not necessarily you trying to do it on your own. The leadership is saying, right, let's begin to understand the problems. And the best way of doing it is to have an open conversation. And we realize we cannot do it without the voices of the BME people, because they are the ones who are at the end of this spire. They are the ones who are feeling the pinch. And therefore, it's really important that we widen that table, bring these people around the table, have these difficult conversations. But I do think, because the institutional leaders are in the majority white, it's really, really important that they become the ones to demonstrate that personal commitment. We cannot solve this. Racism starts at the personal level. Personal racism, those private beliefs that are held by the individual. Then it's spread to the interpersonal. So we cannot tackle racism without tackling the personal. So the leaders must first get it, and then they can spread it.
I'm just going to follow up, Isa, if that's okay. I just want to ask a question about that table extension, because I think if we think about the structures and the systems in the education system in particular, in our heads, we're quite traditional, quite fixed about like how many governors we need or how many SLT we need. How do we extend that table and draw up those extra seats and include those voices at that strategic level without it seeming to be tokenistic, that we're attaching an extra person on because of their background? How do we straddle that and make it authentic and meaningful and sincere rather than tokenistic?
I think you're absolutely right. So it's not simply having me in a room because I'm black, but it's having me in a room, or people like me, because we've got something to say. And not only are you going to listen to what I've got to say, whether it is my research or it is my situated experiences as a BME person that you're going to try to understand, but you're going to listen first of all, and you're going to try and do something. But if you're just simply having me there to tick the box, then you're just simply refining the problem, and it's going to be a merry-go-round. But to move from tokenism is to give me autonomy, to give me a space to be. And that space means listening to me, hearing my voice and respecting my voice. And don't try and gaslight me. So when I tell you that I feel uncomfortable because somebody said this, don't tell me, oh, that doesn't happen here. Are you sure? Oh, I'm sure that's not what they meant. Don't try and do that. Don't try and devalue and discount the experiences. So I think it's really, really important that those leaders, in bringing people to the table, you give them a voice at that table. Otherwise, we're just a merry-go-round.
Right. So I want to take it down to personal, and maybe not hierarchical leaders at the top, because arguably everyone's a leader, right? You don't have to have a position of power to lead here. And so I want to ask about the difficult conversation, and I think it knit in the thread. Somebody asked about, said something about, when we want to do change, we kind of come together as groups, because doing it by yourself is scary, right? The difficult conversation, it is a difficult conversation, and not a lot of people probably could have that. Yet for society to change, to your point, right, it begins at the personal level. I mean, how it's hard to make a stand when you're scared to make a stand. I mean, is there something that you can say or advise as normal people on how to feel, or the mindset to have, so that we become better, we can join the leadership in making the change?
I think, if we are uncomfortable in having the conversation, then that's a sign of fear, and that's a recipe for the problem to continue, and not only to continue, but to get worse. So I think any leader who is interested, wherever you are, in whatever institution, but if you're interested in having this conversation and you're not sure how to have the conversation, then I think you should ask for help. And I think it's really, really important, because from my research evidence, I have seen where the leaders who are successful, or the leaders who try and tackle this thing, are the ones who ask for help. And that is the difference between the accidental activist and the performative activist, or even this sympathizer. So it's really, really important that we understand that the difference is, you got to ask for help, and having asked for help, then you bring people along with you. It's so important that you bring people along with you. This problem is a perennial problem, and this problem is too big for any one person to solve. And I used the term allyship earlier. This problem is about a symbiotic relationship, where I educate you and you use your power and your privilege to help, and together we can begin to turn things around. But more importantly, this is about you leveraging all of your privilege, from your whiteness, from your position, and also leveraging what I have, my situated experiences. I might not have your white privilege, and I might not have your power because you're head of the institution or you're in a leadership role and I'm not. But what I've got is my situated experiences of racism, of discrimination. Now, how can we make those work? And I think leaders cannot shy away from difficult conversations. Leaders have to become comfortable in being uncomfortable. And that is what I've been saying all week. Leaders have to become comfortable in being uncomfortable. And they have to challenge their staff to become uncomfortable as well in being uncomfortable. Listen, the time for change is now. And we are at a significant place in our history. And every leader, you almost have got to take this on almost like you are an evangelist. Almost as if you are so committed to this that you are going out there to crusade and convince everybody. But unless you have that fire in your belly, then unfortunately, it's just going to be, as I said before, a merry-go-round, and somebody's just going to be dodging because they feel, well, I don't know what to do. Yeah. So then you become the sympathizer who is passive.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. And you explain it so clearly. And I think just going back to that symbiotic relationship and the interaction, Rich, can you just pop up the slide from Paul's research into interactions? Because I think it would be good for you to talk everyone through that, Paul, as well, please. And I think what we've heard a lot through these talks is about the fact that we've got the discomfort, but we've got white people, their discomfort is seen as bigger to them than the discomfort of all the people of colour around them. And we've got to be have that pragmatic perspective about the fact that our discomfort as straight white people to talk about these issues is on a completely different scale to the discomfort and the fear that our colleagues are feeling on a daily basis. And that's one of the frames I would like people to really, really listen to and to think about, is that we have got to check our privilege and we've got to put ourselves into other people's shoes. So do you want to talk through this one, Paul, please, to the listeners, please?
Thank you, Hannah. And I think I would invite all leaders of institutions to use this typology to examine their institutions that they're leading, and use the previous one about the typology of leaders to evaluate themselves. So you use these two typologies together, but for different reasons. So this work is about the different types of institutions, because I do think, and as you have rightly said, you know, the change that we're looking for is only going to be really expansive and deep if it comes at institutional level, because institution is the melting pot of society. And so we have 4 types of institutions. The engaged institution, where BME staff are represented at all levels. There's no tokenism there. You are there because you belong, and you're there because people recognize your work and your worth, and they value you. And you're there because the systems are in place to cater to all kinds of diversity, and the culture of the organization is such that we value everyone equally, right? Then the experimenting institution. Few BME staff are in post, but even fewer BME staff are in leadership roles. And then you have the initiated institution, where only very few BME staff are in post, but none are in leadership roles. And then you have the uninitiated institution, where no BME staff are in post. And if you juxtapose this typology against the different types of leaders, you will see some remarkable similarities. So the uninitiated institution, for example, and you think about the indifferent leader who says there is no problem here, or the initiated institution, which has few BME staff in post but none in senior roles, and you think about the passive or the performative sympathizer. You know, it's really, really an interesting juxtaposition here. But it comes back down to this 2 point here. If leadership is not seriously brought to bear in these matters, then the institutions cannot change. But every leader should be saying to themselves, how can I make my institution an engaged institution? And this model can be transposed to other areas of diversity. And every leader should be saying, how can I make my organization an inclusive one that fully represents all of society? And similarly, on the typology of leadership, how can I be a deliberate activist? And I think this is really, really important, that if leaders begin to audit themselves using this tool, and audit their institution using this tool, I think this could begin the start of something really important. But I do think that leaders need to sit down quietly and challenge themselves and educate themselves, and then they take this into their boardrooms or into their staff room and begin that multiplier effect. But I really, really do think that it begins with the person.
So I want to ask you about personal responsibility, or a different side to leadership on pulling people up the talent pipeline of any sector, right? So I speak from my own experience. One of the problems I encountered was partly myself, right? I didn't believe I was good enough. Now, I'm Filipino. We have what we call colonial mentality. I guess it was still institutional racism still in my head. And for the longest time, I really didn't think I was good enough until somebody said I actually was. And my experience even in coaching, so last year I was coaching a lot of talent in Zambia. And I recognized it was also still there. There were a lot of limiting self-beliefs about, actually, I don't think I'm good enough. And do you agree that actually part of what leaders need to do is not only tackle the difficult conversations, but be that kind of leader that truly helps, their talent to believe in themselves as well, right? Because there's something about limiting belief on the other side of this conversation that actually also exists. I mean, do you agree?
Well, first of all, Isa, I think you are good enough. You are good enough. And I just want to tell all of your listeners, I am good enough. So we can have these prisms put upon us and put around us, but I do think that it's important that we rechannel some of that as well. I have two kids, and I tell them all the time. I said, "You're a miller," and you know what that means. I tell my daughter, "You're the most beautiful girl in the world," and I tell my son, "You are the most able. You are the strongest, the fittest. You name it." I affirm them. Right? You're a miller, and it means nobody is better than you, nobody is greater than you, and so on. Now, I think that's what leaders should do: affirm their people. We are lucky to have you. You are the best, you are the brightest, you are the most talented. And I think leaders have got an enormous responsibility to affirm their people, to build them up. But unfortunately, organizational cultures don't allow that in most cases, because organizations have become so viciously competitive. They are so cutthroat. So leaders are more concerned about the key performance indicators around outcomes and performativity things, and not thinking about their people. Well, actually, when a big side of leadership is people leadership, if you don't focus on your people, then they will be demotivated, they'll be demoralized, and you will lose them. So there's a problem there for retention. But if as a leader, you value your people, you support your people, I think that's really critical. Now, in the context of this colonialization that you mentioned, I think this is really important. I have done a lot of research with teachers, in particular overseas trained teachers who come to this country. And I'm saying to them, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, you're here, but you haven't been promoted. And is this a matter of race, or is it a matter of something else? And in some cases, it is a matter of race. And in some cases, it is race plus. So I hear colleagues say, well, actually, in my country, where I'm coming from, you would wait until the head teacher tells you that it's your time. You would wait until the head says you're good enough for this role. But the head never comes and say you're good enough. So you're still waiting to be affirmed. You're still waiting to be tapped on the shoulder. And so that belief of waiting until the head comes, that is what places the limit on you. And I'm saying to people, well, actually, don't wait. You have to affirm yourself. You have to tell yourself that you're ready. You have to tell yourself. And actually, if head teachers or leaders or whoever it is in your institutions are not telling you that, then maybe you need to find somewhere else and go where you will be valued, where you'll be nurtured, where you'll be supported, where your talents will be recognized. Because for whatever reason, and it might not only be race, it might be lack of skills, lack of managerial skills, inexperience among the leaders. So I think it's really important that we do see this as kind of having a racialized element, but there's also a plus element, and that comes to the experience of the leader, the individual people skills of the leader, and so on. But I also think that the BME person has a responsibility to move themselves forward, to challenge themselves, to affirm themselves, because this problem is systemic, but is also personal, and therefore a part of the solving the problem is personal responsibility as well.
You're so eloquent in everything you say, Paul. It all makes absolute sense. I'm just kind of like processing the fact that we internalize our inner critic because the external critic is so loud. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be valued. And when we're not valued externally, we then depreciate our internal value, and it becomes that negative cycle. And ultimately, if we amplified people's strengths and we praised the worth they bring and the value they bring, and we see that and we vocalize it. I'm also thinking about the I'm Remarkable workshops that I run and Isa's been to, about the fact that we have to be aware that different genders, different races, different cultures, different faiths have been brought up in different belief systems. And humility and modesty are a way of being for a lot of people. And a person of colour might not go around with a trumpet shouting about how brilliant they are. And they need to be seen and they need to be tapped on the shoulder. So if we can think about talent management in particular, and thank you for bringing us on to that, Isa, I'm just thinking about the education system, the pipeline. We know it's super leaky. We know that we're not recruiting enough diversity in the first place. But when we look at attraction and then sort of like recruitment and retention and attrition, we are losing so many people from diverse backgrounds. However, we've got lots of white head teachers from rural backgrounds listening today who want to be those deliberate activists. They want to diversify their staff team. They want to get diversity in their governing bodies. How do they start? How do they go and recruit people who don't look like them when perhaps in their local community it is quite white and it is quite homogenized?
It is about being deliberate. It is about looking at their responsibility to the students that they're leading. It is about looking at the kinds of education that they want to deliver to the students. Yes, your school might be white, you have no BME staff, you might not have any BME people, but are you giving them, your students, the best experience by remaining within the status quo? What about your curriculum? Have you challenged your curriculum? So if you think about, again, my work on social justice and activism, I argue that the work of education is the work of social justice activism. In other words, you cannot be an educationalist at any level, whether in the classroom or in the boardroom, but you cannot be an educationalist and not be an activist. And so there are three types of activism, I argue. There is a pedagogic activism. This has to do with the curriculum and the content of the curriculum and the practice of how we teach, how we bring in students from minoritized communities and the quality of their overall learning experience. Are we doing the same old? Are we reading the same books? Are we using the same examples and the same plays? What has updated this year compared with last year, and what has been updated to reflect broader social movements in society? How have we brought in people and their experiences to contribute to our school, even though our school might be located in leafy suburbia? And then regulatory activism. How do we challenge the rules? Do our policies at school provide inclusion for all in terms of hairstyle, in terms of dress code, for example? Not only in terms of race and racism, but those things. Do we make policies that include everybody, or do we make policies that exclude some or advantage some and disadvantage others? And what about national policies? Do we push back on those when we see that these policies are likely to create havoc in the lives of our most vulnerable? Head teachers are very powerful people. Let's be clear about that. So we have to challenge the regulations, and also they are the ones who are the guardians of regulations. They make regulations at school level. So there is that tension. What do you use your activism to do around the regulatory environment of schooling? And then the emancipatory activism. And this is the most crucial one. The emancipatory activism is about liberation. What do you do to liberate people, to liberate all of your students and all of your staff? What systems do you challenge? What systems do you implement? What do you do that upskill and upbuild and demand a higher and a more coherent and a different way of being, a different way of life? You know, social justice is about fairness. And in your own work as a leader, in your own work as a teacher, how do you articulate social justice in a way that liberates everybody, not only for the now, but in a sustainable way? And I think the joy of our practice is within that emancipatory activism, because that is at the core of who we are. Leadership is a uniquely personal activity, and therefore when we talk about emancipatory activism, we are talking about liberating ourselves, liberating our souls, liberating our practices. We don't need that bit cannot be legislated. That bit cannot be legislated, and that bit cannot be taken away from us, because that bit sits at the core of who we are. We don't want the government to have to tell us that we need to do this, because we need to do it because we know that it's right. We need to do it because we know that it's fair. We know that we should do this for our students because it's the right thing to do. So if I'm sitting in leafy suburbia and I think we have got a problem, or we have got no problem, sorry, and so I won't change anything. Well, actually, we have got a problem. We've got a bigger problem, and therefore it is your emancipatory activism which should be saying, well, actually, we might not have the kinds of diverse school population, whether in terms of staffing or students, but actually, I'm going to make my curriculum diverse, and I'm going to give students the most diverse experience they can possibly have, because when that day come, we will be prepared for it. And actually, we are preparing our leaders, not only for this community, our students, not only for this community, but for the big wild world. So when they get out there, they will be suited and buited for human flourishing beyond this community.
When are you going to become Prime Minister, Paul? That's what I want to know. Like, seriously, like, I could listen to you all day. Ultimately, are we not talking about the world we want to co-create, the communities we want to live in, the schools we want to exist in, and the inclusive classrooms that we want to lead? And I think it's that, isn't it? It's thinking about the micro to the macro, thinking about what can we do, what influence can we have on our immediate patch. But one of the questions that's coming up is there are people of colour who would move to a different area to go and be that person and be that first person in a school. However, the community might be hostile. So how do we actually do the kind of the societal piece that if we're going to distribute the kind of the diversity we do have across the country and have more diversity in different schools? Because I've worked in schools where you get your first person of colour and then you end up with lots of people of colour on governing body or in the teaching body because it's a safe place to be. And then you've got your other schools that are very white because they're deemed to be non-safe. So how do we straddle that? How do we go for the kind of the social change as well as the institutional change?
I think the school is the social hub, and education is the seed of transformation. Education is the seed and flower of development. Let's just pause on that for a minute. And therefore, the quality of our education and the quality of our educational institutions really, really does matter. And so I'm not talking about quality in terms of Ofsted. I'm talking about quality in terms of the inclusive curriculum. But I'm also talking about the quality in terms of the community engagement. Now, I've worked with some head teachers who have really done a good job in working with the community, fostering discussion with the community. I have one head teacher that I write about in some of my work, who when he employed in his mat, is a chief executive, and when he employed an Indian head teacher and a couple BME staff, to reflect the diversity of the students, he had an email from his community, from parents, to say, "Oh, the school is looking a little bit dark." Imagine, yes. And what he did, he opened up the school to the community, and every Saturday for 6 months. He would have fates and all kinds of events and open days and you name it, and inviting the community, talking about education, talking about equality, talking about multiculturalism, talking about social justice, and so on. And that was a way of saying to the community, A, we are concerned about diversity and we are here to stay. And B, we are a school in the heart of the community, but the community is in our heart. And I think until leaders begin to get to the place, or at least until they get to the place where they see that, we can't do this problem and think we can't do this solve this problem and think that we can solve it outside of the community. But I do think because the school is a melting pot of the community, then I think is the best place to start to have those difficult conversations. Bring in the parents, have those conversations with them. And you can do it in very subtle ways. International evenings, cultural events, but you can also do it in hard ways where you have the difficult conversations, where you begin to actually problematize the issues, give them the hard data, show them the racist bullying incidents that are happening at school or elsewhere, give them the hard data, give them shock therapy, but you have to work within context. Leadership shapes context and context shapes leadership. That is one of the most profoundly simple statements. Leadership shapes context and context shapes leadership. So I really and truly think that leaders have got to think about their own patch and the characteristics of their own patch. But in thinking about their own patch, thinking about how they can work with the community, because the kids come from those community, and when the bell rings at 3 o'clock in the evening, they go back in those communities, and they are the root of change. And as I said earlier, education is the seed and flower of development.
As a bit of an introvert, right? I mean, on one hand, I completely get excited when we talk about having the difficult conversations and just really going for it. Are there other ways or more softer ways also that we can do to create the change for like people like me, for example, who are who get intimidated, who get afraid of, is there other subtler ways that we can also do to actually attract maybe people who are probably less confident or a little bit more unsure?
I think racism and race inequality is a significant stain on our society, British society. And I think if I were to have a gradient of tools, and I don't, but I think the conversations would be at the softer side. But I do think it is as much about the content of those conversations as it is about the management of those conversations. Those conversations should not exclude the persons who are quiet. Those conversations should not exclude the persons who are already working. Those conversations should not, who are already working on anti-racism. Those conversations should not exclude the persons who are reticent about change. But the leaders should recognize the dynamics and the diversity of people within those organizations and create spaces where all views can contend and work with those persons, whether individually or in different groups, until you can bring the groups together. But I do think it's really important that all people are talking together about the same thing. So it may be a hub and spoke model where some people may need a little bit more because of their lack of understanding, or a different conversation because of their reticence, or more support because of their personality and so on. But ultimately, it is for the leaders to manage those conversations in a way that is inclusive and does not exclude anybody. Because if we begin to have opt-out, then that won't create the solutions we need. And actually, I think this having the conversations is the first step and the most basic step, because there are more severe steps that can be taken.
Can I ask you about the emotion, your person, where you're coming from when you drive change, right? Because there's angry coming from a place of you're angry about it, and therefore I'm going to be an activist. I'm frustrated about it. I'm going to be an activist. I actually coming from a place of kindness, maybe, and I want to be an activist. I'm just wanting to recognize the different I guess, states that you could be coming from when you want to step forward and make a change. And do you have a view about whether it's right or wrong to be an activist if you're coming from a place of you're angry? Do you have a view around, a better place to start from, or be cognizant of where you're coming from when you step into that space of activism?
Well, I do think that he who feels it or she who feels it knows, and therefore I wouldn't come and try and hold up that anybody who is angry about their experiences should be scorned or vilified. And I resist the argument that people who demonstrate are thugs and all of that kind of thing. In the genealogy of the morals, Friedrich Nietzsche talks about this concept of ressentiment, resistance. And he talks about the blunt beast, which is the state. And the blunt beast oppresses the masses. And in response, the masses exert ressentiment, which is resistance. So resistance can come in different ways. We see the typical class system where some people will use the pen and they will get more done. But that's because of who they are. But we also see the masses feeling that they're not listened to unless they demonstrate, unless they shout, unless they scream. And so I wouldn't argue that, one approach is any better or any worse. But what I would hope is that things would sufficiently progress that we would not need to demonstrate. We would not need to be angry or to be accused of being angry. You know what? I am passionate about this agenda. I am not angry. Somebody listening on might say this is an angry man. Oh my God, this man is so angry. But actually, I am not at all. I have been at the brunt of racism in institutions in this country. I have been told by students, get out of my country, you effing dirty migrant. I have been told all kinds of things, and even in the university, I've had my fair share of persecution. But guess what? I'm not angry. I am passionate that change must come, and I think the institutions, the education institutions, has such a huge duty. And so I think if we should distract attention from the real agenda and begin to look at personalities, I think that is a battle lost. Whereas saying, well, actually, this thing has reached crisis proportion, how can I join in?
Thank you, Paul. And all I hear is passion, and passion and purpose, ultimately. So final question, the last 55 minutes have gone so quickly. You mentioned the word progress, and I wanted to finish off with your research around how we make transformative progress and how we are agents of change. So I was going to have the slide pop up. I just wanted you to talk a little bit more about white privilege, white sanction, and the kind of the progress that we need in the future, please.
Yes, this is a decade's worth of research, and in this slide, I talk about this model, and I like to use these models because I'm keen to help people make sense of this issue. So this is about BME staff progression in institutions, and if we start at the bottom left, we see the meritocratic agency. Every BME staff who enters an institution enters an institution thinking that it is on the basis of their belief in the system. That is what is going to help them and allow them to progress. And that is what I found in my research, this notion of personal agency. I believe in the system. I believe that the system will do right by me. But then when colleagues don't get the system delivering for them, you find that something else comes into play. What I've described here as expedient or contrived agency. So we move from meritocratic agency, which is pure, to a kind of polluted form of agency or tainted form of agency. So we join groups, we have to affiliate, we have to adapt, we have to form alliances. And some of these alliances are not necessarily positive alliances. So like going down to the pub, some people don't like going to the pub. Some people have never been to the pub. And I remember one research participant talking about the spiky hair. You have to get the spiky hair, and we have to wear the pinstripe suit. So this is what Marilyn Fry in her research describes as behaving whitely. And then, but this you see is the BME person taking on a new identity. In other words, in order to fit in or to progress. So whereas the meritocratic agency is proactive, you could see that the expedient agency is reactive or responsive. And then you have white sanction. And I think this is really important, where again, white sanction is reactive. But as I describe white sanction is really, really important. It is white colleagues who are saying to BME colleagues, I see you, I hear you, I know the system has been unfair to you, but I am going to use my white privilege to leverage and broker in that system on your behalf. This is a white person saying, I can't change the system, but what I can do, I can use the power that comes with my privilege to help you. And I think in an equitable world, we wouldn't need white sanction. But I actually think any white colleague who actually engages in white sanction is actually doing something about the problem, because they are not sitting on their hands waiting for the Messiah to come. They are saying, well, actually, I've got this solution here. It is my whiteness. And then the final thing is the institutional habitus. If the change is not to institutional cultures and structures, then no change will come. So in an ideal world, the only two things we need is meritocratic agency and the institutional habitus. We would not need white sanction, and we would not need contrived agency.
Paul, this has been an absolute masterclass this morning. Seriously, like Isa and I learned so much on our briefing call. I know you've had an epic week in the last week with launching your website, launching your consultancy, having your launch event on Friday. And I know you're tired, and I really appreciate you being with us on a Sunday morning, sharing your wealth of expertise and experience. So final question to all of us. Isa, what's your takeaway from our conversation with Paul this morning? What's your nugget that you're going to take away?
Lots, so much. Thank you, Paul. You are awesome. Right. Two things. So one around leadership. Everyone is a leader, right? You could be in a position of power, official leader, or anyone who has an opportunity to make a change. You're a leader. And Paul talks about the different levels of opportunity where you can make that change: personal, interpersonal, organization. If you have the opportunity at any of these levels, go for it. And the second thing, my takeout, is for myself personally. And, I've been on this agenda a long time, 20 years. I've lived it as well. And it can get really tiring. And there was something that Paul said at the beginning, the question of, is this the society I want to be part of? Do I want to be remembered to be part of this society right now. I don't want to, actually. For my children, I want to build that society where my children can feel like they belong, they're valued, and they can make a difference. So thank you, Paul. I enjoyed meeting you, and yeah, being part of this conversation.
Thank you, Isa. And Paul, like, you've given us such a depth of knowledge and understanding. If there's one takeaway, what's the one message you want everyone who's tuned in today to really, truly hear and act on?
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Isa. The one thing I would say is the journey is long with miles to go, but keep standing. And this is a collective fight. This is a collective fight. This fight needs you. This fight needs me. And we have to do it together.
Thank you, Paul. I think my takeaway is still the language and how we grapple with the language. Someone's just commented that the word ally, and a conversation I have where I readjust my language because I think I'm using the appropriate language, someone then else says that they don't like that language. And I know we had this conversation last week, Isa, about people with disabilities. So I think it's us working on what this common language framework is, but equally not getting caught up in the words and actually focusing on the activity. Because like you said, it becomes a distraction otherwise if we're sort of like going back and forth about what labels we do and don't use. Let's get the work done and the language will come with it. So Isa, next week we've got a slightly different time of our show because our guest is in the States. Can you tell everyone who we've got on next week, please, and what time our show is?
Yeah, so next week our morning coffee is going to be an afternoon coffee, 3 o'clock, because our guest is from Philadelphia. Her name is Dr. Fran Johnston. It's really timely because Fran is an expert in system-wide change, right? She's a researcher. She's a gestalt practitioner, right? She has worked with the United Nations. She's consulted with government leaders around the world around issues of inclusion. And so this is timely, Paul, because if we talk about institutions and how you make change at that level, our next guest, that's her expertise, Dr. Fran Johnston.
Thank you, Isa. So we'll do a reminder, 3 o'clock on Sunday for our guest from the States. So that leaves us 1 minute over, but we've been to time for the last few shows. Thank you so much, everybody who's tuned in today. Please do share the link on Twitter and also the YouTube link. It's free CPD. Share it with your colleagues, please, and have a fantastic Sunday and a lovely summer break. Take care. Thank you very much.